Going back to my first image, I'm going to keep my eye on the color rendering, my contrast, and my exposure in this image. One of the first things that you want to do to all your images is to go to the optics drop-down panel, that is. And in here you see something that's called Use Profile Corrections. If you click on this, you can see the image corrects itself for any issues that you may be having on your lens. So in my case, if I turn this on and off, I have a vignette or a darker halo around the edges because the particular lens I was using at f-stop 11 starts to lose information on the edges of my image. This is very common. One of the ways that you can fix that is by clicking on Use Profile Corrections, and then you get a full range of detail and color on the borders of your image. One of the most important things to do in Camera Raw is in optics to use profile corrections. If you enjoy your image with a darker fringe around it, there's other options you can do that with, so you can have this fringe of darkness around it. But it's always best to get as much information as possible. So I'm going to continue that, and I'm going to use profile corrections on the 3 images that I have here. Right? In this one, you could really see that there's a difference, especially in this corner. I have some darkness in the corners. Once you use profile corrections, you can see how much more even my image becomes. Down on the bottom of your main window, you're going to see a small square. And if you click on this, this cycles between before and after views of your corrections. Another shortcut is clicking on the Q key to cycle between your images. So this is a really great way to look at the differences that your images after your corrections. So here you see before on the left, and on the right you see after. You could toggle through the different states. Now you have before and after as just a kind of more invisible line here next to each other. Then you have before and after, one on top of the other. Then again, you see a split screen with before and after, and then it brings you back to the normal view. Once you click again, it's side by side, which happens to be my favorite. When you go up to the very top of the right-hand side, you have a lot of different options for correcting your image. I'm going to be showing you the most basic corrections because I'm going to want to bring this image into Photoshop and continue to do my edits in Photoshop. So the workflow that I'm going to be covering is the Camera Raw to Photoshop workflow. And I'm going to discuss some of the options of corrections that you could make in Camera Raw. In Profile, if you click on the Profile window, you're always going to want your profile to be Adobe Color, which is the default. When you click on your basic panel, you're going to see all these different options. Up on the top, you're going to see different options for white balance. So by default, the first option will be as shot. You have a drop-down menu here, and you can toggle through all the different options to see if there's one that you prefer. So you can see here I'm on cloudy, and cloudy as a white balance adds warmth to your image because it's meant to be simulate a day that's cloudy that happens to be cooler. If you have an outdoor image that's cloudy, you click on cloudy, it's going to add warmth to your image, and you can see that very clearly with the before and after image. So you could toggle through these. Some of these are going to look incorrect, like this, that has too much blue and you can't actually tell that there's different colored books in this image. Then you have fluorescent. The last one will be custom. So in custom, you have a temperature slider that you could correct. I usually just leave my image as shot, or sometimes I try auto to see if that clears it up. And actually this looks pretty nice. Below that, we're still in the basic panel. You're gonna have the most important corrections that Camera Raw has to offer. The great thing about Camera Raw is that everything is organized in order of importance. So the most important panel is the basic panel, then comes the curve panel, and then I've already talked about the optics panel. So in the basic panel, you have white balance options, you have a temperature slider, which goes from blue to yellow. But like I said, for white balance, which is temperature, I always decide to keep that on auto. Then under tint, you go from green to magenta, and I usually keep this where it's at, because then it gets more confusing to be able to tell color differences, especially when you're opening up your image afterwards in Photoshop. Another slider that's great if you feel that your image is too dark is going to be the exposure slider. When you slide it to the left, your image gets darker. When you slide it to the right, it gets brighter. And since I have my shadow and highlight clippings on, it's really letting you know that you've gone overboard with exposure. So I'm going to place this somewhere where I'm getting enough detail in the majority of the image. I usually, unless there's a huge issue with contrast, I leave this alone under the basic panel. But now I made my image brighter, so then I could see this area more clearly, but then I'm left with the middle panel that's actually too bright. So the great thing about Camera Raw is that you can alter your highlights, your shadows, your whites, and your blacks independently from each other, which is great. So in highlights, I could take this slider and bring it over to the left. And then in whites, I could do the same, and I kind of take it to my preference. So then you can see before it was dark, but this looked okay. This is my before image. But now my darker areas are brighter, but my bright areas stayed the same. So I could have a better range of tonality in my images. I'm going to now go to my middle image, and I'm going to do some corrections here. I'm going to leave the white balance as shot, but I'm going to take my exposure and open that up a little bit. But again, my highlights got too bright, so I could bring this down for highlight. And this is to my preference. There's no number that I could tell you to hit because everyone's images are going to be different. I'm also going to take the white slider and bring them to the left. So now you could see that overall this image is brighter, but I was able to control independently my highlights, which would be these areas here. And you could see that in this image, I captured some wasps eating a fig. So you can see that I have some issues here. There's tiny little bits of red that you can see. So I can now take my highlight slider, bring it to the left, and my white slider till that corrects itself. Now, if I'm gonna now press my space key and go to a different portion of my image, you can see I'm losing a little bit of information in the shadow and in my blacks. So I could now take the slider, my shadow slider, bring it to the right to make it brighter, and I'm going to do the same with my blacks. So now here in this magnified image detail, you can see that I got a lot more detail. So you can see on this side where I'm having some issues, and for me this image is about the fig, so I do like to have more information there. And then in my highlight, if I go back to that area, and I turn the highlight on and off, you can see I had some effects here, but now I got most of my detail back. So those are very basic corrections in Camera Raw, but you can immediately see in this portion of the image I got more detail. This was a little blocked up, as was the fig, and this image, this corner part of the image. I could then choose to make it a little darker, and then the other things that you can utilize from the basic panel will be down in saturation. This is an image I took with a mix of daylight and a lamp that I was using with a backdrop that was a gradient from pink to orange. I feel that this image is too saturated, so I'm going to desaturate it a bit so it doesn't feel so garish. So now you could see side by side the differences, that just a few basic adjustments, how that helps your image when you work in Camera Raw. With my first image, I still have it side by side. I feel that this image is a bit too blue to my liking. So again, I could check what the auto white balance would be, and that's a little better, but now it feels a bit green. So I'm going to leave it on as shot. I'm going to leave my contrast, highlight, shadow, whites, and blacks as is, and I'm going to close this basic panel.